Jedi, Sith, and the Force are probably some of the most recognizable visual imagery of Star Wars. The vast majority of stories told in this universe of movies, TV shows, novels, comics, and games involve the iconic hum and glow of a lightsaber. But some of the best stories told in a galaxy far, far away don't involve the Jedi at all. And so today, I'd like to turn everyone's focus to a game focused on a non-Jedi character. An Ubisoft-developed game centered around someone who lives her life day by day, armed with a blaster, in the era of the Empire, just trying to make a buck to survive, with a plucky companion helping her out. A game I'm sure you're all very eager to hear about, because who doesn't love the PlayStation Portable? Welcome to Holocron Hoard, a channel with a simple mission: to play every Star Wars game ever made and find the best one. Today, we are not talking about Star Wars Outlaws. You've been fooled. No, folks, we are talking about Star Wars Lethal Alliance, the 2006 third-person action-adventure game for the PSP and Nintendo DS. We're going to talk about the history of the game, the gameplay itself, the story, whether it's Legends or canon, whether or not any of it could be canon, and most importantly, is it good? Is it fun? If you like this video, the concept for the channel, or just Star Wars lore as a whole, please consider dropping a like, subscribing, leaving a comment. You can write whatever you want down there. You can write papaya for all I care. Every one of these pieces of engagement helps new channels like this one a ton. Maybe tell a friend too if they like Star Wars. That's enough preamble. Grab your blasters, strap in, and let's dive into Lethal Alliance. Lethal Alliance is a third-person action-adventure game developed by Ubisoft Casablanca for the Nintendo DS and PlayStation Portable. The release of this game on two platforms is important because the platforms do have differences that we'll get to in a second. For the purposes of this video, I played the PSP version of this game. It's really hard to find the DS version, it turns out. I do know what the differences are between the two, but I haven't personally played the DS version. If you have, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. The developers' stated goals on the platforms were to try and play to the strengths of each: the DS's dual screen with a touchscreen, and the PSP's capacity for greater graphics. The most major gameplay difference, as I understand it, comes from abilities that your companion droid has. In the DS version, you get a special combo attack, and in the PSP version, the droid has the ability to generate a holographic disguise for you. Now, something you need to understand about the PSP if you've never really used one before, or God help me, are too young to have been around when the PSP was invented, is that while it did its best to emulate the PlayStation experience, there are a few key differences with this handheld in particular. One minor one is that there's only one set of trigger or bumper buttons. Not a big deal. The other, much bigger one, is that it doesn't have a right thumbstick. For this game, that means that what controls your ability to turn the camera is the bumpers on the top of the system, and that there's no option for vertical camera control. This is all important because it helps define what kind of game this is. And while it's definitely a third-person action game, it makes the targeting in the game almost reminiscent of tab targeting in an MMO. You'll run through the game's staggering 34 levels, mostly by flipping between hard targets one after another, shooting at them with one of the 4 blasters that the game gives you. 2 of these, the pistol and the rifle, behave mostly the same with a rate of fire difference. The third is a grenade launcher. Probably shouldn't have categorized that as a blaster, but that's okay. And the fourth is a sniper rifle, which is actually the only weapon that doesn't obey the tab targeting style. Instead, equipping this weapon plants you on the ground, and your left thumbstick controls the sniping reticle. It's cool, but I never felt like I really had fine enough control over the aiming for it to be super useful, and planting can definitely get you killed in this game, which means it was a very scenario-specific weapon, which is fine. Snipers can be scenario-specific. Wow, I actually haven't talked about who you play as in this game either, have I? You take control of a female Twi'lek named Rihanna Sa-Ren, navigating a few distinct level types. Most of the levels in this game are pretty straightforward. You run around in third person, blasting up enemies, getting locked in rooms where you need to defeat a certain amount of enemies while your droid, Z-58O or Zio, hacks open a door for you. Other levels will have you racing around, holding Zio Obi-Wan style, hitting dodge buttons, and basically playing a miniature game of Temple Run. There's also 1 or 2 levels that are straight up turret sections, sometimes on the ground and sometimes in space, and let me tell you, the space ones don't have a real reticle, which makes hitting the enemies very difficult. The game also takes a stab at trying to do stealth mechanics. In the PSP version, it has the aforementioned disguise system, which works fine, but other times the game will hint that you can go quiet or loud. Good in concept, but in practice, I found that it was basically impossible to go quiet on any of the missions because the actual stealth takedown mechanics are clunky. In fact, I think generally my summary of playing this game would be that it had a lot of fine to good ideas in concept that just do not play out in practice. Some of that is due to the limitations of the platform itself. You just don't have the control fidelity to do some of what the team was maybe trying to achieve, but some of that is also just due to the game not really being capable of being that deep. This is a game that is at its best when it's at its most basic. Running around, fake tab targeting between guys, shooting a blaster. The moments where you take over Zio don't feel well controlled. A lot of the times the team takedown and combat mechanics that use Zio, particularly in the final boss, are extremely finicky to execute, which leads to a lot of incorrect commands and weird deaths. Sometimes the game just seems to arbitrarily decide you're invulnerable, or else the most vulnerable Twi'lek to ever exist, which results in Rihanna getting to play her hit noise, a noise that is so mid-2000s woman in a video game it'd make your head spin. I was actually playing this around my wife and she commented on it, and I had to explain that this game was like 20 years old and they usually don't make women sound like that anymore. Overall, the gameplay experience fluctuates from fine to frustrating. This is a game that really feels the constraints of the PSP, but also isn't trying to do anything particularly inspired, and so most of the levels don't leave you feeling accomplished, but with more of a sense of, well, that's done, let's do it again with a different background. The game has a boss fight that's a particular highlight, and I do think the temple run sections actually work quite well, but there's not a lot of juice here. But even if the gameplay isn't the best, the story might be able to save it, right? Right? This game takes place entirely before A New Hope and centers around Rihanna Saren, a female Twi'lek who has recently become a mercenary after escaping life as a slave. We open on Rihanna doing mercenary work on Coruscant before being contacted by Kyle Katarn himself, looking suspiciously bearded relative to his appearance during Dark Forces, which would be the closest visual appearance we had for him here. Katarn asks Rihanna to steal a shipment of mercanite that's being held in a warehouse owned by the Black Sun crime syndicate. She gets captured over the course of this job, but is freed by Zio, who becomes her droid companion for the rest of the game. They successfully acquire the mercanite, an Imperial shipment of mercanite specifically, and deliver it to the Rebellion, where they're then contracted by Leia herself to go shut down a drug ring in Alderaan. The drug ring, as it turns out, is tied to the mercanite. The drugs are being used on Mustafar, where mercanite comes from, to increase the slave-driven production of the ore. She also sees the leader of the operation, Slack Cigar, chatting with a Zabrakian slave master, Zarian Keeve, who just happens to be the former master of Rihanna from her time as a slave, and is the one responsible for cutting off the head tail that Rihanna wound up replacing with a prosthetic. In light of the news about Mustafar, Leia wants to send Kyle Katarn to go destroy the facility, but Rihanna insists that she be the one to go, with the ulterior motive of confronting Keeve. She's successful at breaking up the operation on Mustafar, but she doesn't manage to actually track Keeve, and continues to follow him to Tatooine. On Tatooine, she tracks one of Keeve's assistants, Cedrus, before making her way into a compound where she frees some Wookiee slaves, and then finally gets to confront Zarian. Keeve is ready though, and he releases a Rancor, which is probably the game's most interesting, if frustrating, boss fight. In fact, maybe just a peak for the game as a whole, while he makes his escape. You wind up catching up to him, but are captured by stormtroopers and sent to the prison planet of Despair. Wow, clever name. Wowza. She, of course, inevitably escapes this prison, and when she gets to the surface, sees the Death Star orbiting the planet. It turns out, Despair is where the Death Star is being built. A confrontation with Keeve leaves Zio injured, but our dynamic duo finally gets to engage in the most precious Star Wars video game tradition, sneaking onto a shipping crate to go somewhere. In this case, the crate takes them to the Death Star, where Rihanna watches a meeting between Keeve and Darth Vader himself unfold, and then witnesses the destruction of Despair as a test of the space station's power. She also overhears that architects on the planet Danuta are expecting schematics for the Death Star. Rihanna gets into contact with Leia, informs her of the Death Star, steals a transport ship, and escapes the station, heading for Danuta. On Danuta, Rihanna finds plans for the Death Star and attempts to steal them, only to find Keeve taking them himself. She follows Keeve all the way to the end of the station and finally is able to confront him, and after defeating him and his bizarre scorpion battle armor, Rihanna gets the Death Star plans, gives them to Leia, and we roll credits. Rihanna and Zio waiting for their next mission. Look, the story in this game is, to be blunt, not spectacular. It's not bad, there's nothing particularly offensive about it, but it doesn't do a great job of conveying a story. In particular, the turns at the end involving the Death Star just feel completely unnecessary, even ignoring the fact that it doesn't really make a ton of sense in the Legends timeline, where Katarn is usually responsible for getting the Death Star plans. They handwave this away by saying the rebels needed multiple versions of the plans and that Rihanna got updated schematics. You could have just cut the whole plot out and the story wouldn't be any worse for wear. In fact, I think there's a version of this game where it is literally just about a Twi'lek mercenary who runs some missions for the Rebel Alliance while working her way back towards revenge on her former slaver. And you know what? That sounds like a pretty tight story to me. It wouldn't change any of the issues this game has with conveying the story, but I could get behind it from a plot perspective. It's at least maybe comforting for some fans to know that even 20 years ago, we still felt the need to make stories related to one another in totally unnecessary ways. It sounds like I'm being harsh on the story. I am being a little harsh on the story. It's fine. It's just not great. And because the gameplay is also kind of fine, it just leaves a big old meh in your mouth. Let's get to the fun part of the video. If you're not familiar with how Star Wars fiction works, I'm not going to do a big explainer here, although I have linked a short on screen if you want the quick and dirty. But functionally, Star Wars is split into two distinct categories. Legends, which is anything that didn't come from George Lucas himself and happened pre-Disney acquiring Lucasfilm, and canon, which is anything after 2014 and said acquisition. We don't talk about one being better or worse than the other on this channel because it's a really boring argument, even when you're having it in my comments. Both Legends and canon have some great stuff, have some absolute trash bin fiction, and a lot of stuff that falls somewhere in the middle. And anyone who tells you different is lying to you or blinded by nostalgia or whatever. I love all the good. I love some of the crappy Legends stuff. I love some of the bad canon stuff. And I really dislike parts from both as well. There's no shade here. One exercise that we do like to do on this channel when we've established that something is Legends is figure out what it would take to make it canon or what parts of it could still be canon. This game is obviously Legends. It came out in 2006 and all the stuff with the Death Star at the end kind of prohibits the story itself from being canon thanks to Rogue One. But like our Jedi Outcast video, also linked on screen right now, I think there's a few things that you could headcanon as still existing or that could easily be adapted to fit. And I think it basically just boils down to cutting out every single thing related to the Death Star in this game. Conveniently, what I think would have fixed the story for me anyways. There's really nothing in canon that contradicts the existence of Rihanna Saren or Keeve or Zio or even, as we've discussed in the Jedi Knight series of games, Kyle Katarn during this time period. Ancillary story details like Mercanite and the Black Suns exist, and you take the aspects of the story that are really just an ex-slave looking for justice while she works as a mercenary / rebel operative, and the whole plot works. Rihanna Saren strikes me as the type of character whose name we'll see in like Orabesh on a background element somewhere in a future Star Wars project. I've decided a new thing I'm going to do to wrap this particular segment going forward is summarize how much of this you could headcanon or absorb into canon on a new scale. Everyone loves a scale. We're going to go with absolutely none of it, building blocks, story with major changes, story with minor changes, and I guess also like just works. I don't know if anything's ever going to fall into this one, but we have to have an upper end. This one falls somewhere between building blocks and story with major changes. It's probably honestly just the latter. I just don't know if the story is that compelling to begin with. But enough about the story. Let's put a bow on this. When you play through Star Wars Lethal Alliance, you get the sense that it's very much a game constrained by the platforms it was developed for. In particular, platforms that don't necessarily have the greatest control setup for a third-person action game. The gameplay, as a result, feels fine in some places and quite clunky in others, punctuated by occasional sections of excitement, but ultimately feeling more frustrating when you try to deal with the targeting, the stealth, or even just sometimes the movement. The dodge roll can sometimes just kill you because of how clunky it feels. In general, the whole thing feels fine, occasionally bad, and never really great. I don't put that on the devs as much as I do the platform, but it's true nevertheless. It's supported by a generally cookie-cutter story that doesn't do anything particularly well. One that has good narrative bones and conceits. The story of a freed slave getting justice for themselves and finding their way in life has a lot of room to play, but falls short in the execution and is dragged down by a needless tie-in to the main saga in what I'm assuming was an attempt to appeal to fans who only cared about the movies. It's disappointing because I have a special place in my heart for non-Jedi narratives and I always look forward to them. This one I ultimately felt was lacking. When I think about Lethal Alliance relative to the rest of the games on this list, it's really tough for me to place. The further into this project we go, the tougher it becomes because all these games are so different. Star Wars Hunters is, well, was, RIP Star Wars Hunters, definitely a better game than this. I would definitely still play this over Jedi Power, is that true? Would I? Yeah, I think that's true. I think I would. I would play this over Jedi Power Battles. I'd probably rather play Arcade though. Let's slot it right underneath Arcade. It does still have a story, and I truly didn't hate it. I just wish it was more. I'm glad we got that one finished, but I've been playing a bunch of Star Wars games off stream, and now I have a backlog for review. Rogue Squadron, Republic Commando, Lego Star Wars Battles, they've all got stuff coming. If you've missed it, I've also started playing Knights of the Old Republic on stream, at least every Sunday, sometimes more frequently if I'm feeling spicy, and we are having an absolute blast with that. The streams are a ton of fun. Check it out if you haven't joined us. I'm gonna start doing less scripted recap videos as well, I think. These videos just take a lot of time, and I'd like to put out less polished content sometimes in the interest of getting more videos out. If you've made it this far in the video, thank you so much for watching it all and feeding the algorithm. You are the fuel that runs this ship, and I cannot appreciate it enough. That's gonna do it for me today. Until next time, may the Force be with you.